Today we'll be looking into Native American education and representation in urban environments. First, we'll take a look into a timeline to understand how we got to this point in our country's treatment of Native Americans. Assimilation was taking place all over the country in hopes to save the man and kill the Indian at boarding schools like the Carlisle School in Pennsylvania. The tradition of Native culture and education were ripped away. The lack of Native American educational progress over the last century is the result of failed treaties and inability for our country to work alongside tribal nations. Now we'll take a look at a historical timeline to provide some overview. In 1787, the U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, thus established the hierarchy of relationships from the beginning to the present, that authority over Indians is asserted and established by the federal government rather than by the states themselves. In 1887, the Dawes Act chopped up reservations into homesteads and opened up millions of acres of surplus land to white settlers. And by 1887, over 14,000 Native American children were enrolled in 227 schools run by the Bureau of Indian Affairs or by religious groups. In 1934, the Indian Reorganization Act, Congress and the President recognized that the cumulative loss of land brought about by the allotment system had robbed the Native Americans in large part of the necessary basis for self-support. In 1953, the Termination Act, the goal was to have tribes rid themselves of Indian trust land and to terminate federal recognition and services, and in turn, Native Americans would leave reservations and relocate to cities. In 1956, the Relocation Act proposed a sort of forced resettlement to urban areas like Minneapolis, Los Angeles, Denver, Chicago, and San Francisco through vocational training which scattered tribal members far away from their home reservations and communities. In 1969, a special Senate subcommittee on Indian education issues a final report, Indian Education, a National Tragedy and National Challenge, which focused national attention on the grim educational situation of the American Indian and Alaska Native students. In 1972, the Indian Education Act was the landmark legislation establishing a comprehensive approach to meeting the unique needs of American Indian and Alaska Native students. In the 1980s, the number of urban-dwelling Native Americans surpasses rural and reservation-dwelling Native Americans. Then in the 90s, self-determination and self-governance basically allows tribes to determine how they will utilize their own resources and develop tribal services. Continues throughout the 90s. So educational barriers in urban communities. In the 1950s, the Relocation Act resettled tens of thousands of Native Americans to urban areas and scattered tribal members far away from their home reservations. Denver was one of these cities. With promises of work, housing, and community, many of these were unfulfilled. Some of the barriers included inadequate access to transportation, a shortage of school choices, or an enrollment system that may be difficult to navigate or does not cater to individual needs. Today, 70% of our nation's 5.2 million Native American population live in urban settings, leaving them out of federal financial support, which goes to federally recognized reservations and tribal land. In our own community, 592 of Denver's nearly 93,000 students in 2019 identified as Native American. That's less than 1%. And although educator Terry Bissonette suspects that the number is actually higher because some families don't tick the box for fear of being stigmatized or because they identify as both Native American and another race. 17-year-old Antonio Garcia is a Denver public school student and is quoted as saying, "Indigenous students don't have a place in Denver public schools. We're underrepresented, and when we are represented, it's through tokenism." In 2019, educator Terry Bissonette has changed that by opening a charter school called the American Indian Academy of Denver.